The pineapple stitch. Don't be afraid of this complicated looking lace pattern. It is a little complicated, but I love to break down crochet techniques to make them easier to understand. So let's see if we can do that today with the pineapple stitch. For this video, I've prepared row by row written instructions available over on my website, but it's easy to get lost in the row by row instructions for this motif because technically it's a 20 row repeat, which is quite long. So what I think is the better approach here is to zoom out and figure out exactly what we're trying to do with this stitch. And once you have the big picture, you'll be able to read your work and know, based on the stitches below, which stitches you'll need to work next. So let's start with a little pineapple stitch overview. If you're familiar with a granny square, you'll know that it's a crochet motif that has almost infinite variations, and the pineapple stitch is no different. But rather than a square, the idea behind the pineapple stitch is to alternate these two types of shapes. Generally one that starts out small and grows in a somewhat triangular pattern, and one that I think of as the actual pineapple, which starts out wider and decreases towards the top. And you can see how their shapes sort of fit together. Generally, with the pineapple stitch, our aim is to create these shapes at the same time, i.e. in the same row, and connect them with a series of chains. Let's zoom in a little more and examine two of the important stitches within these motifs. For the triangular section, it's this little V-shaped stitch pattern here, which in my written instructions I call a shell. It's just 2 double crochet, chain 2, 2 double crochet, and generally you're working shells into previous shells. And we will use these shells to frame our pineapple and increase to create the base for our next pineapple. You can see here that I started to increase by adding a chain 2 space, then by working 2 shells, then 3 shells, then chaining between the 3 shells until it's time to start our pineapple. Then, once you've built this double crochet cluster base, creating the pineapple is actually really easy and way more sort of automatic than the written pattern might make it seem. You're making little chain 3 loops, which are anchored down by single crochets. And with the way you work the little chain 3 loops, it automatically decreases your shape by 1 loop each row. So the count of the loops will be in the written pattern, but I just wanted to show you that you don't really have to count. So that's enough blabbing overview. Let's get started with our pineapple shawl. And I love the construction of this one because we start with 1 full pineapple motif, then increase to 2 and 3 and so on. And I think it's just such a fun way to start a triangle shawl. Now this produced a kind of long and narrow shawl, so I decided that it was meant to be worn on the bias, with the pineapples kind of dancing sideways along the shawl. I used 1 full Lion Brand mandala cake in the colorway Pegasus, and a 4mm hook. To begin, make a slip knot, and chain 4 or 5 chains. Then slip stitch into the first chain to make a little chain ring. Chain up 3, which will count as a double crochet, and continue making a shell into the ring by making 1 double crochet, chain 2, and make 2 more double crochets into your little chain ring. Just right into the center of the ring right there. And we're going to start with a sort of super shell. So chain 2 more and make 2 more double crochets into the ring as well. And that completes row 1. You'll have 3 sets of 2 double crochets with chain 2s between them. Chain 1 and turn. To begin working row 2, we're going to slip stitch over to our first chain 2 space. So slip stitch into the first stitch, and into the next stitch, and go ahead and slip stitch right into the chain 2 space. Now we're going to begin working our first shell. To do that, chain up 3 which counts as a double crochet, and make another double crochet directly into the chain 2 space. Chain 2, and put 2 more double crochets right into the chain space from the previous row. Without any chains between them, work another shell directly into the next chain 2 space. And that completes row 2. You will have 2 full shells. To begin row 3, again we'll chain 1, turn, and slip stitch over to your next chain 2 space. Chain 3 and complete a shell into the chain 2 space. Now you will work your next shell into the gap between your 2 shells of the previous row. Finally, work a shell into the last shell. And that completes row 3. We've gone from a super shell to 2 shells to 3 shells, and that theme will continue to pop up throughout this pattern. To begin row 4, chain 1 and slip stitch over to your chain 2 space. You probably know what to do here now. Work a shell into that first shell. And when you have 3 shells in a row, the next row will also have 3 shells with chain 2 spaces between them. So chain 2 and work your next shell into the center shell. Chain 2 and work a shell into the last shell. Chain 1 and turn, and row 5 is exactly like row 4, except you will have 3 chains between each shell. So work a shell into the previous shell, chain 3, shell into the shell, chain 3, and 1 more shell. And don't take a shot every time I say shell in this video. And once you've worked our little row of 3 shells with chain 3s between them, that means on our next row you will get to start the base of your first pineapple, which we will work directly into that center shell. So chain 1, turn, slip stitch over to your chain space, and make a shell into the shell. You're going to be doing that a lot here in this pattern. Chain 3, and we're going to work 9 double crochets all into the center shell. Yep, count them, 9 double crochet cluster into the center shell. Finally, chain 3 and work a shell into the last shell to complete the row. Moving on to row 7, chain 1, turn, and slip stitch over to your chain space to work your first shell. And here's how you're going to treat the 9 double crochet cluster in order to set up our pineapple. Chain 3, ignore that chain 3 below, and work a double crochet right into that first double crochet of the cluster. Chain 1 and work a double crochet right into the very next stitch. And repeat, chain 1, 1 double crochet in the next stitch, until you've worked across all of the 9 double crochets in your cluster. You will have a total of 9 double crochets and 8 chain 1 spaces. Chain 3 and work a shell into your last shell to complete the row. Row 8. Chain 1, turn, and slip stitch over to your next chain space. Complete a shell into the previous shell. Chain 3, and we'll start our first set of pineapple loops. Skipping everything in between, work a single crochet into the first chain 1 space. Chain 3 and work a single crochet in the next chain 1 space. Repeat, chaining 3 and working single crochets into each chain 1 space until you've run out of them. And since you started out with 8 chain 1 spaces, you'll now have 7 little chain 3 loops. Chain 3 and work a shell into the last shell to complete the row. Row 9 starts out with that familiar shell. And now the key to continuing on in your pineapple is to make sure you always skip that first chain 3 ladder that's connecting our shell to our pineapple. Chain 3 and work 1 single crochet into the first little chain 3 loop of our pineapple motif, the one that has a single crochet on either side of it. Chain 3 and single crochet in the next chain 3 loop. And repeat, chain 3, single crochet in the next loop until you've worked into each of them. Chain 3, and again work a shell into your last shell. I went ahead and did row 10 as well because it's exactly the same thing as row 9, and your pineapple will automatically decrease by 1 loop if you crochet this way. Now this is the one point where you're gonna kind of have to pay attention and count because it's time to increase at the beginning of the next round. And I'll show you an easier way to know when to increase later on. But since this is our first increase, just know that you need to do it now on row 11, aka after we've done 3 rows of chain 3 loops. So we're about to work the 4th row of loops, and this is the one that we will need to begin with an increase. So on row 11, chain 1, turn, slip stitch over to your chain space, and we're going to work a super shell, much like how we started off the whole pattern. So work 2 double crochet, chain 2, 2 double crochet into the previous shell, chain 2 again, and work 2 more double crochets into the same shell to create 2 chain 2 spaces that we can build off of on the next row. Now we're just back to plain old Pineapple Town, so chain 3 and work a single crochet in the next chain 3 loop. Repeat, repeat, repeat across all your little loops. Chain 3 and work another super shell into the last shell of the row to mirror what you did at the beginning. Row 12. Chain 1 and slip stitch over to your first chain space to complete a shell into the chain space. Then work another shell directly into the next chain 2 space. And now you've got 2 shells. Starting to look familiar? Back to some regular old pineapple. And chain 3 single crochet into each chain 3 loop. Now your pineapple will have 3 loops left. Chain 3 and work 1 shell into each of the chain 2 spaces at the end of your row. Row 13. Chain 1, turn, and slip stitch over to your chain space. Work a shell into your previous shell. Then work a shell in the gap between your 2 previous shells. And again, work 1 more shell into the next shell. And now you have 3 shells. And I bet you might even be able to guess what to do on the next row, but don't worry, I'm going to show you anyway after we do some more pineappling. Chain 3 and single crochet in each chain 3 loop from the previous row. And you've whittled your pineapple down to 2 loops. Work 3 shells at the end to mirror what you did at the beginning of the row. Row 14. Chain 1, turn, and slip stitch over to your first chain space. And work a shell into the previous shell. Chain 2, right, and work a shell into the previous shell. Chain 2 again, and work a shell into the next shell. Chain 3 and work a single crochet into the next chain 3 loop, and you'll only be able to repeat that 1 more time to create your last little loop of your pineapple. Chain 3 and work 3 shells at the end of your pattern with chain 2 spaces between them. Row 15. Chain 1, turn, and slip stitch over to your first chain space and complete a shell in each previous shell with chain 3 spaces between them this time. Chain 3 and work 1 single crochet into the last little chain 3 loop on top of your pineapple. Chain 3 and work your 3 shells with chain 3s between them. How cool is that? We've worked our triangle increasing sections while completing our pineapple decreasing section at the exact same time. And now we've created 2 bases for us to build our new pineapples on top of. On the next row, we will in fact put 9 double crochet clusters in those center shells. And to close up the top of the pineapple, after you've worked your 3rd shell, all you have to do is go right into the next shell with no chains or stitches between them and work another shell. So after row 16, you will now have 2 9 double crochet clusters to work your next pineapples into. On row 17, you'll build those chain 1 spaces up again. And the only technique I haven't shown you how to do yet is what we do when we get to these little connected center shells above your previous pineapple. Chain 3, and into these we're going to work what I'm going to call an expanded shell. Put just 2 double crochets into the chain 2 space of the first shell. Chain 2 and put 2 double crochets in the chain space of the next shell. So it's kind of like you took those 2 shells and turned them into 1. And on the next row, you will work a shell into that chain 2 space. Continuing on, you'll put the chain 1 spaces into your next pineapple. And at this point, I think you pretty much have all the techniques you're going to need to continue on in this pattern indefinitely. But let's go take a look at the shawl to get our bearings, and I'll show you how I more easily spot when my next increase row is supposed to begin. So you can see here on the next row, I worked a shell into the expanded shell, and our pineapples kind of share a shell in the middle here for about 3 rows. So that's how I keep track of my increases. I just continue on in the pattern, and then I look to my last expanded shell, because it's kind of easy to spot. I count up 1, 2, 3 single shells between pineapples. And once I have 3 shells here, I know that on the next row, I'm going to start with a super shell. And once you have a super shell, you know how to turn it into 2 shells, then 3 shells, and so on. And the pineapple just kind of makes itself. One last little tip. I think the shawl looks best when we end after a 9 double crochet cluster row. It doesn't have any loose chains. I think it just kind of gives it a nice finished look. So there you have it, my version of a pineapple stitch shawl. I hope that the stitch is a little less intimidating now. Once I got the hang of it, I thought it was actually really fun to crochet. And if you're absolutely in love with pineapples now, please consider purchasing my paid pattern for this equally beautiful pineapple stitch crochet top. I'll have all the relevant links down below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye!